Good morning. This is Patrick Shepard with the U.S. Office of Government Ethics, and I'm very pleased to be joined this morning by Dr. Martha Joynt Kumar from the White House Transition Project. Thank you very much, Martha, for taking the time to speak with us. Welcome to OGE's YouTube channel.
Oh, thank you very much, Patrick. I'm very glad to join you. OGE does a wonderful job in the presidential transition process in making sure that ethics are front and center in all of what the candidate preparations involve.
Excellent. Well, thank you. We really appreciate that. Our preparations, we work really hard to make sure we're ready for presidential election years. So you're the director of the White House Transition Project, and many of the ethics officials in our community have supported past presidential transitions, but I suspect many of them are not familiar with the project. Would you mind sharing with us a little bit about what the project is and what it does?
Sure. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan group of presidency scholars who are political scientists, and we write about topics that relate to presidential transitions. And some of our main work is focusing on White House operations and the offices that are important for a good start. And so what we do is interview people who have served in the office as directors or deputies about the functions of the offices and then the responsibilities of the directors, and that is looking at it over time. And we also do organization charts that go back to the Reagan years so that people can see when they come into an office just how it's been organized. And some of the offices are ones that are not well known, like the staff secretary's office, which is an important office because the staff secretary is a person who tracks the paper that goes into the president. And then when it comes out, then is responsible for figuring out what needs to happen on particular issues that the president discussed. So there are about a dozen offices that we look at. And for us, transition is not just something before or after the election, but whenever anybody comes in. And so into a leadership position in the White House, and they want to know how offices work, then they can use these materials. So transitions, particularly in this administration, where you have a turnover at the assistant to the president level, that's the highest level of staff. We have about an 85% turnover of the first year staff. By the end of August, it was about 85%. So you have people just coming and going. I think while there are 25 people, it's limited to 25 people that have the assistant to the president title. In this administration, it's about 79 people have had that title at one point or another, and that is much higher than his predecessors and President Trump's predecessors. So there is a constant swirl there.
Fascinating. No, so I think that's an important thing because a lot of people coming in during a transition or entering a new role really need to benefit from some of that historical information and lessons learned during previous administrations.
Right. I think, what happens is when people come in to a White House or into any other offices, they think that history began the day they walked in, or at least the day their president walked in. And then pretty soon they recognize that there's a continuing aspect to operations. Like in the White House operations, you'll notice that the same offices go from one administration to another, like staff secretary, counsel, press secretary, chief of staff, and there are reasons for that. There are constituencies out there that want to make sure that these offices are maintained. And so there is a sameness, even if there are differences in the hierarchical structure and who reports to whom and how many people can get in to see the president. without going through the chief of staff. That varies between administrations and actually within administrations too. But the historical aspect is very important, I think, for people coming into office to know that there's a continuity to government, and that's true in the whole area of ethics. There's a continuity in what people want to know about their office holders.
And I think that's a great point. And the folks in the ethics community, the people that we work with every day at OGE, they're often looking through the keyhole of the financial disclosure process at the huge machine that makes possible a presidential transition. And I think it would be helpful to them to get a sense of who are the major players, what organizations and people have to work together to help a new president get his or her team on the field.
But at the beginning of legislation that related to transitions, which only goes back to 1963. Before that, political parties were mostly the ones involved in funding a transition process. But the basic legislation is 1963, and then that has been amended several times. And during that amendment process, more government institutions have gotten involved. So it's not just GSA and the candidates. Now you have OGE, which is created in 78, and as well as GSA. Then you have the director of national intelligence is also involved, the Department of Homeland Security, and within it, the Secret Service, and then also the group that carries out the Homeland Threat Assessment, which is provided to the candidates. General Accountability Office, OPM, Personnel Management, FBI, and the Department of Justice, the National Archives. And then, you have the Senate involved in the confirmation process. So there are a lot of institutions that are involved. So going from a point where there was no legislation to just GSA providing some space, you now have the president responsible for creating the White House Transition Coordinating Council and the Agency Transition Directors Council. So there is an increasing awareness of the importance of a presidential transition as a volatile time, and one where there are vulnerabilities that probably don't exist at other times, because you have a lot of people leaving government. Once if their president loses or is at the end of an 8-year term, then people want to go get jobs. So you have a lot of people at the leadership levels who leave, and then career people taking those spots. And then it's a while before the new people come in. And so if a major crisis occurs during that time, it can be difficult to get a team on the field. And an example would be in 2008, you had financial talk of financial collapse, the meltdown that occurred beginning in September of 2008, which before that, the candidates were talking about particular issues that they were interested in. McCain and Obama were. But then when the financial collapse appeared, then that final month is taken up with that. And then once Obama won, then the Bush administration was working with the candidates and then worked with Obama. But there were a lot of things that they were doing that were not mandated by law, but rather were the result of President Bush having said that he wanted a year earlier the best transition possible because we were in two wars. And Josh Bolton, who was the chief of staff for President Bush, who was tasked with running the transition operation, and he was very active in bringing in the representatives from both sides separately, but bringing them into the White House, even in the summer of 2008, brought them in to deal with software for for all the people who were going to be sending in their resumes, which was over 200,000 people as it ended up. But they were very proactive and said a lot of things actually that they did then in their pre-election period, as well as the post-election, then became law. And that has been, it's been an aspect of transition law. It's based on experience. That is based on the positive experience of what the Bush people did. And then sometimes things that don't work out so well, like details. The last legislation in 2019 was trying to deal with fixes to things that had happened in the last transition, making things more more nailed down in the memorandum of understanding and that sort of thing, such as who is responsible, making somebody responsible for the ethics rules, making sure that the candidates had ethics rules, and the president-elect had ethics rules, but who's enforcing them? And so the legislation required that somebody be tasked with that responsibility on the team.
Excellent. So there are really a lot of aspects to the transition. It's the ethics vetting is really important. Helping people exit government at the end of their federal service is very important. But there are also national security aspects to the transition and vulnerabilities. And
Yes.
all of that.
I'm going to say there are also some outside groups too. There are groups that watch what's going on in government, and like CREW, which is the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, and it is interested in transparency and has lawsuits over meetings and that sort of thing, making sure that the public has information. And then there's a whole community of lawyers that are involved in the transition process too, on appointments, because financial disclosure for people who are wealthy and who have headed companies and who have traveled a lot around the world and have to fill out forms of all the places they have gone, and also all their financial dealings. There are people who hire a lawyer or a law firm like Steptoe and Johnson and Holland and Knight have practices where they help people through the Senate confirmation process. And a lot of that really involves gathering information and making sure that it's accurate.
Yeah. And speaking of those disclosures, those of us in the ethics community who work in the financial disclosure area have noticed a big increase over the last decades in public interest in those reports. And you've written extensively about the role the media plays in the transition. Do you think that media interest in the transition and the attendant documents is likely to increase? And do you have any sort of insights into why their interest is so elevated?
Well, I think it really goes back to the Freedom of Information Act in the latter part of the 1960s, where Congress put the burden on the government institutions to say why they were not going to make something public Um, and before that, somebody had to prove there was a reason they should be allowed to see some documents, but it's been turned on its head, and the responsibility is now on government. And I think that the more people found out about government, the more they wanted to know. And you also have, with social media, it's very easy to discover information. And I think, say that Congress was a somewhat distant institution where you read about it in the newspaper, but then C-SPAN comes in and you can watch the floor debates, you can watch hearings, and then you have in the 1990s, you have cable television coming and bringing a lot of information about government. So people found there was much more to government than they had known, and they were interested in who the players were, and while they were at it, what kinds of influences were there on them, and uh, were they using information that was insider information on stock trades and that kind of thing? And once you get cases that come out and you have legislation, then there's more and more interest in who the people are that are serving. Because now we regularly see cabinet members, and say decades ago, that was not the case. And the more you see people, the more you want to know, where did they come from? Where did they get did they have a lot of money? Where did that money come from? And is there a conflict of interest here? And people have, I think, always been interested in conflicts of interest, but now you can see the players and you can get the information. And so there's more and more requirements on transparency.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the points that we see in the ethics community a lot, especially in the period immediately after an election. Incoming administrations are always interested in getting their players on the field as quickly as possible. And we have a situation where ethics programs and ethics officials feel a lot of pressure to get vettings done quickly, but also pressure from the outside because lots of people want to see the results of their financial disclosure review work. The Senate's very interested in that. And that's
Yeah.
particularly true for the first 100 days. We hear a lot about the first 100 days. What is the significance of the first 100 days? And so, is there anything ethics officials should know about that period?
Well, there you can guarantee that on April 29th, these organizations are going to be doing 100-day stories. How is the team doing? And and whenever there's an evaluation that you can know about beforehand, you want to make sure to have everything lined up and have some significant accomplishments for that time. But I think there's another aspect to it too. At the very beginning, the Senate, which you only have the Senate involved in the confirmation process, so the Senate is willing to spend time on looking through the backgrounds of people and working on the confirmation process. But it's not going to be long before then they're going to get itchy to do their own legislating and focus on their own policy concerns. So when you look at the statistics, that the people that are put forward early get through faster. And so you want, as a president, to stand up the government as soon as you can, and your best chance is doing everything early. And so that's why there's so much pressure, say, from the Office of Presidential Personnel to get things moving. But sometimes you find that that they are the weak link there, that it takes them a while to nominate people, or that they send over names before they've done complete assessments. And so that slows down the process and makes the Senate process longer. But it also makes it more difficult for them to get through quickly if they don't do all of that early work.
And I think that's That's something really important. The project has cataloged a lot of lessons learned from previous transitions, and that theme of prior planning and timeliness seem to come up again and again. And why is that timeliness so important, and what can ethics programs do to help ensure that they are ready to assist an incoming administration in that initial rush?
Um, I think you have explicit instructions, which you all have, of what forms need to be filled out and what kinds of information they are asking for, and having the people working on personnel, say for candidates. This is well before the party convention, that candidates have to have a personnel operation in place and know well what the rules are going to be, because some people are just not appropriate candidates for a government position because of some of the conflicts they may have had in the past, and so they have to be able to filter the people out and know what the rules are and who can fit in with them and who's willing to provide the information. There was one person that I saw who worked in the Obama administration, who was very wealthy, and to get through the confirmation process with all the legal work that he had to have done, his tab ran up to $400,000. Well, there maybe not a lot of people that are going to want to spend that kind of money, but everybody has to know, both the candidates and the people that they put in place early on, what the process is. So, in Reagan's case, even back then in 81, well, in 1980, he hired Pendleton James, who had a headhunting firm and knew the whole process of appointments and who was a good candidate and who wasn't for government positions. He was one of the first people that he hired for the transition, because personnel was so important. And George W. Bush had Clay Johnson, who had worked on personnel matters for him and setting up a computer system that would handle resumes when he was governor. And so he was the first person he appointed to run the transition and then to handle personnel. So personnel is a huge part of the transition process and has to be in place early, because you want to filter out those people who are not appropriate and bring in those people who are.
No, I think that's a really good point, and just for the ethics officials who are watching, I want to remind them of some resources that are available, because you mentioned the expense and difficulty that some individuals can have complying with the ethics requirements required to take a government position. And our guide for nominees is a publication that OG has developed specifically for potential nominees that really emphasizes the burdens that they will face during the confirmation process. And we really hope that that document is helpful in setting those expectations and maybe reducing some of the surprises and frustrations that you encounter as reviewers.
Right. Because one of the problems for people who are being put forward is the length of delay, and the frustration of not having a hearing, and then having to put your own job on hold. So there are a lot of frustrations. I think it's the earlier everything can get done, the better.
Absolutely. And so this is not just an election year. We're about a month out from election day, but we're also managing a global pandemic. Has the project been thinking about the effects of the pandemic? It's not hard to imagine a world in which, with mail-in voting, that we don't know the results of the election on election day, so we might have to compress the transition period. Do you have any thoughts on that, and any sort of suggestions for ways that the government can prepare itself?
Well, I think if you look at truncated transitions, you can go back to the Bush one that was about 37 days instead of 78. And with that process, they were able to have a smooth transition in. I mean, when you look at when their cabinet members were named, it was by early January. Now, in one of the things to take into account is that there could be a second term for President Trump, which would mean a lot of work on cabinet changes, because most of the recent presidents have named new people very early on. President Clinton, for example, named his cabinet, his choices for the second term in December, and Bush did as well. So there, no matter what happens, there is going to be a lot of work on going through people for the top leadership posts. I think that if you look at the transition in 2008, beside the financial collapse, we did have the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and so it is always a volatile period where you have to be prepared for just about anything. But here we know the economy is badly affected by the pandemic, and that that if Biden were to come in, then he has talked about what kinds of things he would do to get hold of the pandemic, as far as mapping out a government plan that comes from the federal government rather than from the states. And for that, he has a longtime associate, Ron Klain, who handled the Ebola issue when it came up, bringing together various governments, departments, and agencies. And I think also he did Zika. So you will find that I'm sure he is working on that with the Biden team. And so you've got the things you can figure that are coming, but then there are things that happen that either during the transition period or early in administration that you may or may not be prepared for. So, for example, when George H.W. Bush was leaving office in early December, he joined a UN effort and sent troops to Somalia, and on a humanitarian mission. But it turned out to be something far different, where our troops were attacked by jihadis, and we ended up losing 44 troops in the year that they were there. And so here, Clinton is faced with a situation that that began before he came in, but became a hot button issue for him. He also had in February of '93 was the first attack on the World Trade Center, and then you had also the situation in Waco with David Koresh and the FBI and alcohol, tobacco, and firearms involved in a battle, a siege, what ended up being a siege in Waco, and but you didn't have a attorney general until confirmed until mid-March, and April was when the siege occurred, and I think about 79 people died in that. So there are things that can take place that you hadn't anticipated, and you need to have people, department secretaries there and their team in order to handle it. And in that case, Janet Reno really was coming in late.
And I think that's a really good point and something for ethics officials to keep in mind. You know, we feel the pressure just to get the personnel work done and have the people entering their offices. But really, the reason that's so important is because the world doesn't take a break because we're undergoing a transition. We have law enforcement matters, we have health matters, we have financial crises, we have foreign policy problems that all persist across administrations. So really, as ethics officials, we're working to ensure the continuity and ability of our country to respond to crises that we may not foresee. So that is why we spend all this time preparing for this period.
Right, because if the government is continuous, and its operations are moving like a ship under sail.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any final sort of thoughts for the ethics community as we count down the last few days until the next presidential election?
I think that while candidates for various government positions may find it frustrating, I think the public finds it heartening to know that that there are people that are interested in the integrity of the governmental process and want to be able to find out what kinds of conflicts of interest there are. And so I think the work you all do is work that's really appreciated. Although it may be that that people in the ethics community hear first from the people who are having to fill out all of the forms, but it's an important aspect, I think, of government life, that that there's a watchdog there. And there was a person that I talked to who did ethics work in a White House, and he said that that he thought that the whole notion of it was important, that there were rules that had to be followed, because he said he would get a lot of calls from people in government wanting to know before they did something if it was a conflict. And so I think that is an important aspect of your work too, of knowing that you all are out there and that there are ethics officials in the White House and in the departments who are going to be watching, that people are going to think twice before they do something. And so I think that's an important thing to take into account too, that there are a lot of ways in which you impact the governmental process that you may not hear about.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to all of our viewers. We hope you found this helpful. And I think the real takeaway here is that your work over the next few months is not just important to the ethics community, it's important to our country and our ability as a nation to respond to all sorts of challenges. We wish you the very best luck in your preparations.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to talking to everyone again very soon.